It was a Tuesday morning when the sky stopped being just the sky. People were doing normal things. A man in Houston was drinking coffee on his porch and watching the sun come up. A woman in Cairo was walking her daughter to school, holding her hand, talking about what they would cook for dinner that night. A fisherman off the coast of Sydney was pulling in his nets and humming an old song to himself. The world was moving at its usual pace, slow and ordinary, the way it always did in the early morning. Then the ships came. They did not sneak in. They did not try to hide. 47 warships dropped out of the sky above Earth's atmosphere, like they owned everything beneath them. They were massive, each one the size of a small city, dark and sharp-edged, built to look like something that had never once needed to be afraid of anything. There was no message from them. No attempt at contact. They simply started firing. The first city to go was Houston. The beam that came down from the lead ship was not like anything a weapon should look like. It was silent. It was almost beautiful, a pale white light that widened as it fell. And then Houston was gone. Not damaged, not burning, gone. Turned to a flat glowing sheet of fused glass in less than 4 seconds. Sydney went next, then Cairo. In 6 minutes, 11 million people were dead. Colonel Nathan Briggs was underground when it happened. He was standing inside the operations center beneath Cheyenne Mountain, watching the feeds on 6 different screens at once, and his face had gone completely still. He was not a man who panicked easily. He had served 22 years in uniform and had seen bad things before. But nothing in those 22 years had prepared him for watching 3 cities vanish from a map in the time it took to drink half a cup of coffee. Beside him stood Admiral Louise Carver. She was the head of the United Earth Space Fleet, a force that had been built mostly for patrolling, peacekeeping, and protecting orbital stations. It had never been built for this. She had her hands flat on the edge of the operations table, and she was staring at the screens with the focused, unblinking look of someone making very fast calculations inside her head. "How many fighter wings can we get airborne in the next 10 minutes?" she asked. Nobody answered immediately. The room was still processing what it had just seen. 10 minutes, she said again, quietly, in a tone that moved people. The room started moving. The alien ships, later identified as belonging to a species called the Veilthari, had conquered 42 worlds before they arrived at Earth. Not one of those worlds had put up a real fight. The Veilthari were silicon-based creatures, heavy and cold and precise, and they moved in battle like a single organism. They did not argue with each other. They did not hesitate. Their fleet moved and fired and repositioned with a kind of mechanical coordination that had made every previous enemy feel like it was fighting something more like weather than soldiers. They had expected Earth to be the same, a brief, clean erasure, 3 days at most. They did not expect the missiles that came up from the Rocky Mountains 12 minutes after the attack began. They did not expect the fighter jets that screamed up from hidden air bases across 4 continents, small and fast and absurdly brave. They did not expect the pilots inside those jets to keep flying, even after losing half their squadron in the first exchange. And they absolutely did not expect Lieutenant Cody Harlan. Cody was 29 years old. He flew out of a base in Nevada and had not slept the night before because of a card game that ran too long. He was not the best pilot on the base, not officially, but he was the most stubborn one. When his ammunition ran out in the middle of a fight with a Veilthari interceptor, he did not break away. He looked at his instruments, looked at the enemy ship, and made a decision that his instructors back in training would have called insane, and his fellow pilots would later call pure Cody. He used his cargo hauler, a beat-up transport he had modified with a magnetic pulse device built from parts he had pulled out of a power station transformer 3 weeks earlier, on a hunch, and he flew it directly into the interceptor's engine housing. The pulse detonated on impact. The enemy ship went dark and began to fall. Cody's own engine caught fire on the way back down. He landed with one engine burning and a hole in the cockpit wide enough to put a head through. He was on the ground for 38 minutes. Then he went back up. By the end of the first day, the Veilthari had not won. They had not lost either. But they had expected to be done by now, and they were not done. And that alone seemed to confuse them. The High Conductor, which was what human translators ended up calling the commander of the Veilthari fleet, sent a message down to Earth's surface as the sun went down on the first day of the invasion. It was short, and it was clear. It said that if humanity did not stop all resistance immediately, the fleet would begin total sterilization of the planet's surface. Every living thing, no exceptions. General Petra Daniels received that message in an underground conference room with 11 other people around the table. She was the head of the United Nations Emergency Council. She was 61 years old, had spent her career in strategic planning, and was not a person who was easily pushed. She read the message twice. Then she set it on the table in front of her and looked at the faces around her. There were scientists at that table, engineers, soldiers, doctors, all of them tired, most of them scared, none of them talking about giving up. They expected us to fold on day one, she said. They hit us hard because they thought one hard hit would be enough. It wasn't. She paused and looked around the room again. They've never fought a species that gets angrier when it's hurting. They've never fought a species that uses fear as fuel. They've never fought us. She leaned forward slightly. We are not going to ask them for mercy. We are not going to surrender. What we are going to do is make them regret the day they ever pointed their ships at this planet. And we are going to start tonight. The room was quiet for a moment. Then everyone got back to work. Outside, in the dark above Earth's atmosphere, the Veilthari fleet held its position, waiting for the humans below to break. It had no way of knowing that the people it was waiting on were not breaking. They were building. And that was the most dangerous thing in the universe. 3 months passed. They were the hardest 3 months in the history of the human race. Not just because of the destruction, though the destruction was enormous. 40% of Earth's orbital stations were gone. 6 major cities had been turned to glass. Food supply chains across 4 continents were broken. Hospitals were running out of medicine. Power grids in entire regions were dark. Millions of people were living in tunnels, basements, and makeshift shelters dug into the sides of hills. The Veilthari had not won. But they had not left either. Their fleet still sat above Earth's atmosphere, like a bruise that would not heal, sending down strike ships whenever they spotted organized resistance, destroying supply depots and communication towers, and anything else that looked useful. They were patient in a cold, methodical way. They believed, based on everything their records told them about conquered worlds, that time was on their side. That the humans would eventually run out of food, run out of weapons, run out of the will to keep going. They had never been more wrong about anything in their lives. Because while the Veilthari waited for humanity to collapse, humanity was doing the one thing it had always done best when its back was against the wall. It was solving the problem. Deep beneath the Rocky Mountains, inside a facility that appeared on no official map, and had no name on any government record. A man named Dr. Calvin Hurst had not seen sunlight in 11 weeks. He did not particularly miss it. He was too busy. Calvin was 44 years old, thin in the way that people get thin when they forget to eat, with dark circles under his eyes that had become a permanent feature of his face. He wore the same gray jacket every single day. He drank coffee from a machine down the hall that made a grinding noise and produced something that tasted more like warm disappointment than actual coffee. He did not care. He drank it anyway and kept working. The facility was called the Forge by the 300 scientists who worked inside it, though no one had officially named it that. It had just become the word everyone used, the way nicknames sometimes just happen. The mission of the Forge was simple to say, and nearly impossible to do. Take everything humanity had captured or observed from the Veilthari, study it, understand it, and find a way to use it to end the war. Working in the lab next to Calvin was Dr. Naomi Voss. Before the invasion, Naomi had spent her career studying dark matter. She had published 31 papers, had her work cited by scientists on 6 continents, and had been considered one of the best quantum physicists alive. Now, she was using those same skills to study Veilthari hull plating, energy signatures, and weapons systems. She had filled 11 notebooks with observations, calculations, and diagrams. She had written in the margins of every single page because she kept running out of room. Naomi was not a soldier. She had never wanted to be. But she had watched the feed when Cairo went down, and she had a daughter who was now living in a shelter in northern France. And she was the kind of person who responded to fear by working harder and faster until the fear had somewhere to go. Together, Calvin and Naomi found something that changed everything. It started with an anomaly in the energy readings of a Veilthari shield system they had pulled from a downed interceptor. The shield did not draw its power in a straight line the way human energy systems did. It pulsed, it breathed almost, in a rhythmic pattern that repeated at a very specific frequency. Naomi noticed it first, at 2 in the morning on a Thursday, when everyone else in the lab had gone to sleep. She stared at the readout for a long time. Then she woke Calvin up. What they discovered over the following 3 weeks of testing and cross-referencing and arguing with each other across a table covered in coffee cups and notebooks was that the Veilthari shielding system was not just a shield. It was a network. Every ship in the fleet was connected to every other ship through something they began calling the harmonic crystal matrix, a shared energy core buried deep inside each vessel that kept all the shields synchronized and strong. It was a brilliant piece of engineering. It was also, once they understood it, a fatal mistake. Because if you could find the exact frequency that the matrix used, and if you could produce a pulse at that frequency that was powerful enough, you would not just knock out one ship's shields. You would send an overload signal through the entire network. All 47 ships at once. And the overload would not just knock the shields offline. It would fold back into each ship's own power core. Every ship in the fleet would destroy itself from the inside. Calvin sat alone in the lab for a long time, after they confirmed the results for the 3rd time. He sat very still and stared at the numbers on the screen in front of him. Then he picked up the phone and called Admiral Louise Carver. "We can kill all of them," he said. "All 47 ships, at the same time, in less than a minute." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "What do you need?" she asked. 6 months, he said, "and a small miracle." "You have 4 months, she said. "Build your own miracle." While Calvin and Naomi worked underground, Colonel Nathan Briggs was very much above it. He had been coordinating the global resistance effort from a series of moving locations, never staying in one place longer than 48 hours, always one step ahead of the Veilthari strike teams that had been trying to find him for 2 months. He was not a flashy man. He did not give speeches. He communicated in short, clear sentences and expected people to act on them without needing to be told twice. Under his coordination, human resistance fighters across every continent were making life extremely unpleasant for the Veilthari ground forces. Not through big organized battles, because those were impossible to win right now. Through small, constant, exhausting pressure. Ambushes in underground tunnels. Supply lines destroyed by civilian drones. Communication relays hit in the middle of the night by teams of 4 or 5 people who were gone before the enemy could respond. Booby traps built from whatever was lying around. Electrical parts, fuel canisters, old industrial equipment. The Vielthari ground commanders kept sending reports back to the fleet that used words like irrational and unpredictable to describe the human fighters. One report said the humans did not behave like a species that was losing. It said they behaved like a species that was waiting for something. That report was accurate. Back in the forge, Calvin was staring at his screens at 3 a.m. when Naomi slid a piece of paper across the table to him. On it was a rough sketch of a satellite device, modular, small enough to be assembled in orbit without drawing attention. "If we build 32 of these and position them right," she said, "we only need one shot." Calvin looked at the sketch. He looked at Naomi. She looked exhausted and completely sure of herself at the same time, the way she always did when she knew she was right. He picked up a pencil and started making notes on the sketch. Outside, the Vielthari fleet waited in the dark above Earth, still convinced they were winning. Below them, in a room with no windows, 2 scientists were quietly building the last thing the Vielthari would ever see. 4 months and 11 days after the forge began its work, Dr. Calvin Hurst stood in front of something that had no proper name yet. The device sat on a long metal table in the middle of the lab, surrounded by cables, tools, empty coffee cups, and stacks of handwritten notes. It was not large. It was not dramatic looking. If a person walked in off the street and saw it, they probably would not think much of it. It looked like a compact satellite frame, modular and gray, full of carefully arranged components that only made sense if you understood what each one was doing and why. It did not look like something that could end a war. But most things that changed the world did not look like much until they were turned on. The team had started calling it the Echo Array. The name came from Naomi, who said that what it did was essentially throw a sound back at something until that something shook itself apart. Calvin had told her that was not technically accurate. She had told him it was close enough, and the name had stuck. 32 units of the Echo Array had been quietly assembled in orbit over the past 6 weeks. They were hidden inside the debris fields left behind by the orbital stations the Vielthari had destroyed in the first days of the invasion. It was, in a grim way, the enemy's own destruction being used against them. The wreckage that was supposed to represent humanity's defeat had become the hiding place for humanity's answer. The Vielthari had not noticed. They had no reason to look closely at floating debris. They had never fought an enemy that thought this way. Each unit was positioned with extreme precision, its angle and distance calculated down to fractions of a degree. The work had been done by a small team of orbital engineers operating under total communication silence, using only short-burst coded signals that looked like ordinary system noise to any sensor the Vielthari were running. It had taken 3 weeks and had aged every person involved by what felt like 10 years. Inside the lab, Calvin ran the final checks for the 4th time that morning. Not because he doubted the results. He had stopped doubting the results after the 8th simulation, when the numbers came back identical for the 8th time in a row. He ran the checks because standing still made his hands shake, and working kept the fear in its place. Naomi sat across the room, her 12th notebook open on her knee, writing in her small and precise handwriting. She was not checking calculations anymore. She had checked them so many times, she could have recited them in her sleep. She was writing something else, something personal, but she did not explain what, and Calvin did not ask. The principle behind the Echo Array was the same one they had discovered 4 months ago at 2 in the morning. The Vielthari shielding network ran on a harmonic crystal matrix, a shared frequency that connected every ship in the fleet to every other ship. The Echo Array was built to match that frequency exactly, and then push a pulse through it at a power level the matrix could not absorb. The shields would not simply fail. They would fold the overload back into each ship's own power core. The ships would not go offline. They would come apart from the inside, every single one of them, all at once. The day Admiral Louise Carver brought the plan before the United Nations Emergency Council, the room was very quiet. Carver stood at the front of the table and spoke in the same calm, direct way she always did. Not raising her voice, not adding drama to something that already had enough of it on its own. She told them what the echo array was. She told them how it worked. She told them what it would do if it functioned as designed. And then she told them what would happen if it did not. If it works, she said, we destroy the entire fleet in a single strike. If it does not work, we lose 32 satellites, and the Veilthari will know we tried something. After that, the war is most likely over within the week, and not in our favor. There is no middle ground here. There is no backup plan. This is the plan. Nobody spoke for a moment. General Petra Daniels looked at the faces around the table. Some of them were afraid. All of them were tired. Every single person in that room had lost something in the past 4 months. A city they grew up in, people they loved, a version of the world they would never get back. Petra knew that. She carried it the same way they did. We vote, she said simply. The vote was unanimous. Back in the forge, Calvin got the confirmation call that evening. He listened, said 3 words, and hung up. Then, he sat down in his chair, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling for a while. Not because he was worried. Not anymore. The science was right. The engineering was right. He had checked everything so many times, there was nothing left to doubt. He was quiet because he understood, in a way that was hard to put into words, what the next few days meant. Not just for Earth, for the idea of Earth, for what it would mean in the long history of this galaxy, that a species no one had taken seriously had looked at extinction and decided to build something instead of beg for mercy. He found that thought both heavy and strangely peaceful at the same time. The night before the firing sequence was scheduled, Naomi stayed in the lab long after everyone else had gone. She sat in the quiet with her notebook open and the low hum of the equipment around her, and she thought about things that had nothing to do with physics. She thought about the 42 worlds the Veilthari had destroyed before Earth. She thought about the people in Houston who never had a chance to run. She thought about her daughter in the shelter in France, who sent her short voice messages every few days and always ended them the same way, with "Come home soon, Mum." She would, she thought. Soon. She looked down at her notebook and wrote 1 sentence at the top of a fresh page. She wrote it slowly, the way you write something you want to remember. We were afraid the whole time. We did it anyway. She closed the notebook and sat with that for a while. Outside, across the dark silence of Earth's orbit, the 32 units of the Echo Array waited in the debris, still and cold and patient. They did not know what they were. They did not know what they were about to do. They were just pieces of metal and wire and carefully arranged components. But in less than 12 hours, they were going to make 47 of the most powerful warships in the known galaxy disappear. And the universe was never going to be the same after that. Part 4. The Silence That Followed the Fire. The clock on the wall of the operations center read 0358 when Colonel Nathan Briggs walked in and took his place at the main table. The room was already full. Every seat was taken. People were standing along the walls with cups of coffee they were not really drinking, eyes on the screens, voices low. The air had that particular kind of tension that does not feel like noise. It feels like the moment just before a very large door opens, and nobody knows what is on the other side. Admiral Louise Carver stood at the far end of the table. She had not sat down in 3 hours. She was looking at the orbital feed on the main screen, where 32 small objects drifted quietly inside the debris field above Earth. From the outside they looked like nothing, broken pieces of dead stations, junk left over from the early days of the invasion. The Veilthari fleet floated less than 400 kilometers beyond them, massive and dark and completely unaware. At 0400, Carver looked at the technician on her left and said, "Begin the sequence." The technician typed 4 characters and pressed a single key. For 2 full seconds, nothing visible happened. The screens showed the same orbital feed. The debris field looked the same. The Veilthari fleet looked the same. The room was so quiet that Nathan could hear the hum of the ventilation system in the ceiling. Then, the echo array fired. All 32 units pulsed in a chain, so fast and so precise that the entire sequence lasted less than 1 second. There was no sound from the devices themselves. No visible flash. No dramatic beam of light cutting across space the way it did in old science fiction films. Just a wave of precisely tuned energy moving outward from 32 points at once, invisible and perfect, spreading toward the Veilthari fleet at the speed of light. It reached the nearest warship in just under 3 seconds. The first thing the screens showed was a single ship going dark. Not exploding, not breaking apart, just going dark. All at once, every light and energy signature on it cutting out simultaneously, like a lamp being switched off. For half a second, it looked like the ship had simply powered down. Then the second ship went dark. Then the third. Then they all started going at once. The harmonic crystal matrix inside each vessel did exactly what Calvin and Naomi had calculated it would do. The resonance pulse hit the shared network. The overload had nowhere to go, and it folded backward into each ship's own power core with a force the cores were never built to handle. The detonations were not loud. They were not enormous fireballs. From a distance, they looked like small, very bright stars appearing briefly in Earth's orbit, and then vanishing, one after another, in quick and quiet succession. 47 of them, in less than 58 seconds. Then the orbital feed showed nothing but debris and silence. Inside the operations center, nobody moved for several seconds. Nathan was staring at the screen. He had his arms folded across his chest, and his jaw was tight, and he was not blinking. Around him, people were frozen in the same way. Every face pointed at the same screens, every mind trying to catch up with what their eyes had just seen. The room felt like it was holding its breath. Nathan unfolded his arms and looked at the senior analyst to his right. "Run it again," he said. "Confirm every contact." The analyst ran the confirmation sweep without a word. The results came back in 94 seconds. 0 active energy signatures. 0 structural integrity on any hull. 0 survivors. The analyst looked up from his screen and gave Nathan a single nod. That was when the room came apart. The sound that came out of those people was not a cheer exactly, not at first. It was something rawer than that. It was the sound of people who had been holding something very heavy for 4 months and had just been allowed to put it down. Some people shouted. Some people grabbed whoever was standing next to them. One analyst in the back row sat down on the floor and covered his face with both hands and shook, not from sadness, but from the sudden release of everything she had been carrying since the day Houston disappeared. Admiral Carver stood at the end of the table and watched her people and allowed herself one long, slow breath. Then, she straightened her shoulders and started giving the next set of orders, because the war had been won, but the work was not finished, and she was not the kind of person who stopped moving just because something good had happened. The news moved across Earth in waves. Underground shelters, field hospitals, resistance camps dug into hillsides, crowded basements in broken cities. Everywhere that people had been surviving and fighting and waiting. The message arrived, and the reaction was the same. Disbelief first, then confirmation, then something that was too big to be called just relief. It was the feeling of a species that had looked at its own end and refused it. But the story did not stop at Earth's orbit. Across the galaxy, 41 other civilizations monitored deep space communication channels as a matter of routine. Most of them had been following the situation at the small blue planet in the Orion Arm, with varying degrees of interest. A few had watched with something close to pity. The Veilthari were a known quantity. The outcome of their campaigns was well established. When a Veilthari fleet targeted a world, that world was gone within days. It had happened 42 times. There was no reason to expect the 43rd to be different. So when the Veilthari fleet's energy signatures disappeared from long-range sensors, the first assumption most of these civilizations made was that the conquest was complete. The fleet had done its work and gone quiet. Standard procedure. Then the sensor analysis came back, and the analysis said something that did not fit any standard procedure. 47 resonance signatures, gone simultaneously, not relocated, not powered down for transit, destroyed. All of them. In under 60 seconds. The Galactic Consensus, a governing body made up of representatives from 23 spacefaring civilizations, convened an emergency session within 72 hours of the readings. The session lasted 3 hours. For most of that time, the representatives talked in careful, measured language about data verification and sensor accuracy, and the statistical probability of equipment error. The representative from the Theran Collective said nothing for the entire 3 hours. The Theran were one of the oldest civilizations in the known galaxy, calm and deliberate, in a way that younger species sometimes mistook for slow. They were not slow. They simply did not speak until they were certain. At the end of the session, when the chair of the consensus turned to the Theran representative and asked for a statement, she was quiet for a moment longer. Then she spoke. "We have made assumptions about that world," she said. "We should revisit all of them." The session ended without a formal resolution. The representatives filed out in near silence. In the hallways outside the chamber, conversations that had started as analysis quietly became something closer to unease. These were civilizations that had mapped stars, built structures that lasted 10,000 years, and crossed distances that would take a human lifetime just to calculate. They were not easily unsettled. But something had changed in the last 72 hours, and every one of them felt it, even as none of them wanted to be the first to say it plainly. The small blue planet that everyone had written off was still there, and the fleet that was supposed to erase it was not. 6 weeks after the last Veilthari warship went dark above Earth's orbit, the planet was still very much broken. That was the part the rest of the galaxy did not fully understand yet. Winning had not put the cities back. Winning had not filled the empty seats at dinner tables. Winning had not undone the 11 million lost on the first day, or the millions more who followed in the months after. The glass fields where Houston and Cairo and Sydney used to be were still there, flat and pale under the sun, and they were going to be there for a long time. Winning a war and recovering from one were two entirely different things, and humanity was only at the beginning of the second. But people were coming up from the shelters now. That was something. Children who had not seen open sky in months were standing in doorways and looking up at a space that was, for the first time in 4 months, empty of enemy ships. Supply lines were slowly being rebuilt. In dozens of cities, people who had never met before the invasion were working side by side, clearing rubble, repairing roads, planting food in whatever soil was left. There was grief everywhere. There was also, underneath it, a stubborn and quietly fierce energy that had not been there before. The kind of energy that comes from a people who had been told, without words, that they did not matter, and who had responded by proving otherwise. It was into this world, still raw and rebuilding, that the first diplomatic signal arrived. Admiral Louise Carver was in her office at 0600 when it came through, reading reports she had been putting off for 2 days. The signal had already been verified 3 times by the communications team before it reached her desk, because nobody wanted to be the person who brought their admiral a false alarm. It was a formal transmission from the Galactic Consensus, encoded in a mathematical language format that their best linguists had been able to translate within 4 hours. Carver read it once. Then she called General Petra Daniels. Petra arrived 20 minutes later, still pulling on her jacket. She read the transmission standing up, the way she read everything when she was in a hurry. When she finished, she set it down on the desk and was quiet for a moment. The galactic consensus was not demanding anything. It was not threatening anything. It was, in careful and measured language, requesting a conversation. It said that the events of the past 5 months had raised significant questions for many of the consensus member civilizations, and that those civilizations believed a formal dialogue with Earth's representatives would be of great value. It was, in the long history of interstellar diplomacy, about as polite as a first contact message could be. Petra allowed herself a small, tired smile. "They're nervous," she said. "Yes," Carver agreed. "They are." The Emergency Council debated the response for 3 full days. It was not a quiet debate. There were strong opinions on every side, and not much patience left in anyone after 4 months of surviving an invasion. Dr. Calvin Hurst, who had come up from the forge, looking pale and thin and slightly bewildered by natural light, argued clearly for openness. "Share the technology," he said. "Build trust. Step into the wider galaxy as a partner, not a threat." Humanity had earned its place at the table, and should sit down at it. Dr. Naomi Voss argued just as clearly for caution. The galaxy had watched 42 worlds get destroyed and done nothing. These civilizations had looked at Earth before the invasion and seen something small and unimportant and not worth their attention. That had not changed because Earth had won a fight. Trust was not something you handed over because someone sent you a polite message. It was something that was built slowly, with evidence, over time. Colonel Nathan Briggs said almost nothing during those 3 days. He had, by that point, left the operations center and gone back to the surface. He was in Colorado, in a small town that had taken heavy damage in a Vailthari ground strike, helping a group of volunteers clear a collapsed school building so it could be rebuilt. He sent one short message to the council on the second day of debate. It said, "Whatever we decide it standing up, not on our knees and not with our hands out." The council read it and moved on. In the end, it was General Petra Daniels who drafted the response. She did it herself, alone in her office late at night, with a cup of tea that had gone cold beside her. She wrote it the way she always wrote important things, plainly and without extra words, saying exactly what she meant and nothing she did not mean. The response was 3 paragraphs. The first paragraph acknowledged the galactic consensus, accepted the invitation to open a dialogue, and expressed a genuine willingness to engage with the wider community of spacefaring civilizations. It was warm, without being eager, respectful, without being submissive. The second paragraph was clear in a way that left no room for misreading. It stated that Earth was not looking to be assessed or studied or placed into any category that the consensus had built for other worlds. Humanity would participate in the galactic community on its own terms and at its own pace. It would not be rushed, managed, or guided by external bodies that had shown no interest in Earth's existence until Earth had done something that surprised them. The third paragraph said that Earth mourned its dead deeply and was focused on rebuilding its world. It expressed a sincere wish for peace with any civilization that wished peace with it. And then, in language that the consensus's own translation systems rendered with complete clarity across every known communication protocol, it noted that the Echo Array remained in orbit, that it had been significantly improved over the past 6 weeks, and that Earth considered it a defensive instrument, which it would remain, so long as no one gave humanity a reason to think otherwise. Petra read it back to herself once, then she sent it. The response from the galactic consensus took 9 days to arrive, which was fast by interstellar standards. It acknowledged Earth's position, expressed respect for humanity's losses, and confirmed that a formal dialogue channel was being established. It was professional and carefully worded, and between every line of it carried the unmistakable quality of a group of very old and very powerful civilizations, choosing their words with great care around something they had decided they did not want to accidentally upset. When the Tharan Collective's senior analyst finished reading Earth's original 3-paragraph response for the second time, she set it down on her desk and sat quietly for several minutes. Her staff waited. She was not a person you rushed. Finally, she looked up and said, "Remove the human civilization from the emerging species file. Remove it from the primitive contact candidate file as well." One of her staff asked where it should be filed instead. She thought about it for a moment. "Open a new file. We will find the right name for it later." On Earth, on a cool and ordinary morning in the city of Denver, which was slowly coming back to life around its wounds, Naomi Voss sat at a small table outside a cafe that had reopened 2 weeks earlier. She had a real cup of coffee in front of her, the first one she had tasted in months that did not come from a broken machine in a windowless lab. It was good, simple and warm and good. She watched people walk past on a street that still had cracks in the pavement, but was being used anyway. A group of children ran by, laughing at something one of them had said. An old man sat on a bench across the street, reading a paper in the morning sun. Somewhere down the block, a musician was playing a slow and easy song on a worn guitar, and the sound of it drifted up the street and mixed with the smell of coffee and fresh air. Naomi opened her 12th notebook to a new page. She uncapped her pen and held it for a moment, thinking. Then she wrote, in her small and careful handwriting, the first line at the top of the clean white page. "They thought silence meant we were finished," she wrote. "They did not understand that we go quiet when we are working." She looked at the line for a moment. Then she closed the notebook, picked up her coffee, and sat back in her chair and looked up at a sky that was just the sky again, wide and blue and full of nothing threatening at all. Above it, unseen but present, the Echo Array waited in orbit, patient and still. And somewhere out in the deep dark of the galaxy, 41 civilizations were very quietly reconsidering everything they thought they knew about the small blue world at the edge of the Orion Arm. The end.